A cloud hides the sky. A nuclear shadow falls across the human future. Midway through the 20th century, two superpowers prepared for a conflict which might have ended life on the planet. Spring flowers, the warm light of day, the pleasures of life. But under this American hotel was a hidden gate. It led into an underworld. This was the shelter for members of the United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. Down here, the politicians would represent the dead and the dying in the world overhead. For a handful of human beings, there was all they needed to wait out the nuclear winter. But nerves might snap, then order would be kept by force. The lost world above the shelter would become only a memory, a myth. The living would come to envy the dead. Berlin, 1945. Soviet troops had stormed the capital of Hitler's Reich. American, British, and French soldiers soon joined them in the ruins. Churchill, Stalin, and Truman were the official victors of the Second World War, but a special triumph was Stalin's. Russian power had pushed forward into the center of Europe. At Potsdam, outside Berlin, the Big Three met to settle the post-war order. Winston Churchill represented a Britain exhausted by war, while Joseph Stalin, supreme ruler of the Soviet Union, faced Harry S. Truman, 33rd President of the United States. It was 3 months after the death of President Franklin Roosevelt that Harry Truman, once a Missouri haberdasher, set off for Potsdam. It was his first overseas conference as head of state.
President Truman was unprepared for the presidency in the sense of being fully briefed and up to the minute on all that was going on. But as a senator for the past 10 years, as chairman of one of the most important congressional committees of the war, he was well aware of the major problems that a president had to face.
Stalin was late for the conference. He had a sort of heart attack. Anyhow, he came one day later. He visited Churchill and Truman and immediately apologized for being late.
The Soviet Union was devastated by war, but Stalin remained a formidable figure.
I went up to him and I said, "Marshal, this must be a great satisfaction to you after all the trials that you've been through and the tragedy that you've been through, to be here in Berlin." And he looked at me and said, "Tsar Alexander got to Paris."
Did Stalin want to push on to the Atlantic? Lenin, his predecessor, once hoped the Russian Revolution would lead on to communist world revolution. It was then, after the First World War, in a clash of ideologies, communist and capitalist, that the Cold War had its origins. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson took ship to the European Peace Conference with his gospel for a better world, safe for small nations, sound for business. But his peace settlement excluded Bolshevik Russia. Many nations, including the United States and Britain, sent troops to fight the Russian Revolution. Churchill, fresh from victory over Germany, urged, "Kill the Bolshoi, kiss the Hun." The intervention left Lenin and Stalin convinced that the West would seize any chance, embrace any ally, in order to destroy communism.
I joined the Civil War as a so-called son of the regiment. We were young boys. We knew we were fighting for the people, the poor people.
There was widespread support for the Red Army. The foreign troops soon withdrew. The Bolshevik Reds defeated the Whites, their Russian enemies.
The White Guards, who had left Russia, were encircling us. There was starvation. It was a time when sausages were made from human flesh.
In Russia, famine followed civil war. The victorious Bolsheviks turned away from the outside world to build up the economy at home. America also turned inwards. People wanted the good life and no more foreign entanglements. Then, in 1929, Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression began. Suddenly, across the richest nation on earth, millions faced destitution. American politics shifted to the left.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God.
Roosevelt promised a new deal for Americans. He would manage capitalism for the public good. And in a change of policy, he recognized the Soviet Union.
One has to remember that we had been, I think, for 16 years without any representation in Russia, no relations between the two governments. And FDR was the one who decided to try to break that logjam.
Stalin's industrial drive soon attracted American experts. Some brought their families. While Soviet muscles strained to raise dams and blast furnaces, American corporations supplied skilled engineers on contract. Communist ideology didn't worry them. Unlike the Russians, they were free to go when the job was over. Stalin was master of the economic plan, a tyrant who tolerated no failure and no criticism. Privately owned fields became collectivized prairies. The cost of collectivization was the murder of millions of peasants and renewed famine. The truth was kept secret.
People didn't really know all about the bad things. All the achievements were put down to his initiatives. Those who knew otherwise would shut up. They knew if they said anything, they would be imprisoned and shot. It was a regime of terror.
This was socialism in one country. Heavy industry's output doubled in 10 years.
Stalin felt that in order to get public support for the things he was doing, which were very harsh policies, he had to convince a great many of the people, the common people and the party members, that Russia was confronted with a conspiracy on the part of the major capitalist powers to undermine the Soviet government by espionage.
Lenin's old comrades confessed to imaginary crimes.
Игра разоблачена. Маска предательства с их облика, с их лиц сорвана. И сорвана раз и навсегда. Пусть прогремит ваш приговор, как освежающая и всеочищающая гроза справедливого.
I could see them there with their pale faces, their twitching lips, their evasive eyes. These were the faces of men who had been, if not tortured, then terrified in many ways, and often by threats to take it out on their families if they didn't confess.
The Moscow trials tore away some foreign illusions. Stalin's Soviet Union was revealed as a police state, not a workers' paradise. But even in America, thousands stayed loyal to the communist dream. In the 1930s, Moscow called for a popular front of the left against Hitler and fascism.
Within the shadow of the giant skyscrapers, the red cohorts of communism gather at historic Madison Square.
Fighting the spread of fascism became the great cause for socialist and communist alike. Doubts about Stalin were repressed. In Spain, volunteers from all over the world rallied to oppose the fascist rebellion launched by Franco. Franco was armed by Mussolini and Hitler. In Germany, the Nazis were rearming. Hitler did not hide his ambitions to dominate Europe and then the world.
Ein Sowjetzeichen soll er vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen!
Roosevelt wanted to keep out of any European war.
Despite what happens in continents overseas, the United States of America shall and must remain as long ago the father of our country prayed that it might remain, unentangled and free.
Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, trusted that Hitler would listen to reason.
When I was a little boy, I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try, try, try again.
In September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Munich. War seemed close as Germany prepared to invade Czechoslovakia. But Chamberlain went determined to appease Hitler. At Munich, Britain, France, and Italy licensed Hitler to seize the Czech Sudetenland with its German minority. Czechoslovakia's allies had abandoned her. In Moscow, Stalin drew lessons from Munich. The Western democracies, he concluded, would never stand up to Hitler. Stalin planned a desperate stroke of diplomacy. The fascist and communist arch-enemies were about to embrace. Hitler flew his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to Moscow. The Nazi-Soviet pact was signed by Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. The West was appalled.
After the pact was signed, I heard this from Stalin's lips. He was often at our home. He said, we need to win time, at least 2 years' time. Only then will the Soviet Union be able to defend itself against Germany.
September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on the aggressor. Too late to save Poland. Defeated, Poland was wiped off the map. Germany and Russia had conspired against her. In eastern Poland, the communist occupiers were supervised by Nikita Khrushchev. They were taking over provinces once ruled by the Tsars. The Nazi-Soviet pact left Stalin free to grab Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Baltic states were back under Russian domination. Stalin had already outraged the world by invading Finland.
The Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. It has allied itself with another dictatorship, and it has invaded a neighbor so infinitesimally small that it could do no conceivable, possible harm to the Soviet Union.
In 1940, Hitler struck west. By mid-1941, France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Denmark, Yugoslavia, and Greece had been added to his conquests. Churchill's Britain held out alone. On June the 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. It was a day that changed history. Hitler meant to win a vast colony for Germany. Instead, his act would bring Russian power into the heart of Europe only 4 years later. The future outlines of the Cold War began to form as the Nazi tanks surged forward. The Red Army fell back in retreat.
My mother said, go with the soldiers. The soldiers were retreating, injured, covered in blood. I only had my overcoat and my shoes, that's all.
Soviet citizens rallied. Abroad, the Soviet Union won unexpected friends.
Churchill, in spite of his past anti-Soviet feelings, at once welcomed Stalin to Russia as an ally. He did say to his friends, of course, that he'd have welcomed the devil if the devil had turned up in order to help him defeat Hitler.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
America declared war on Japan. Days later, with the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, Hitler rashly declared war on the United States, making Russians and Americans allies. The German thrust at Moscow was blocked. Stalin broadcast to the nation.
И эти люди, лишенные совести и чести, люди с моралью животных, имеют наглость призывать к уничтожению великой русской нации. Немецкие захватчики хотят иметь истребительную войну с народом СССР. Что же, если немцы хотят иметь истребительную войну, они ее получат.
Stalin already looked beyond victory. He told the British that post-war Soviet boundaries must include the Baltic states and part of Poland.
When I went to Moscow with Anthony Eden in December 1941, when the Germans were still only 19 kilometers away from us as we talked, the very first thing that Stalin said at that meeting was, Mr. Eden, I want to have your assurance that at the end of the war you will support my just claim to all these areas, you see. And Eden was able to take it back and said, but oughtn't we to be thinking about how we win the war? No, no, said Stalin, I would like to have this clear at the very beginning. So Eden obviously had to say, well, he had no authority to discuss how the war was to end.
American aid to Russia concentrated on guns and trucks. But Stalin and his people cried out for more, a second front, an Allied landing in Western Europe to relieve Soviet suffering.
I saw the atrocities. I heard the noises of war. Although it's 50 years ago, I can still hear the noises of war. The shells, the bombing, people screaming, women crying.
For 6 months, battle raged at Stalingrad. Hitler sent 500,000 men. The Germans were trapped and forced to surrender. The tide of war was turning. Western opinion cheered on the Red Army their comrades in arms.
The Russians have thus far lost in the common cause at least 50% more men killed, wounded, and missing than all the rest of the European allies put together. And moreover, they have killed, wounded, and captured at least 20 times as many Germans as the rest of the Allies.
The Nazis sought ways to split the alliance against them. At Katyn in western Russia, they dug up the corpses of more than 4,000 Polish officers. Germany announced, truthfully as it turned out, that the officers had been murdered by Soviet security troops in 1940. Britain and America chose to ignore this evidence of Stalin's methods. In 1943, with their alliance still intact, the Big Three prepared to meet at Tehran in Persia.
I was summoned to Tehran to help them prepare for the conference. Mr. Roosevelt is supposed to arrive. We had the code names for it. And so I called the airfield, and sure enough, I spoke to Admiral Leahy. I said, "Are you coming?" And he said, "No, we're not coming. We're going to American mission." And when I said that to Molotov, I thought he'd just fry me alive. I said, "What?" And he'd get all the four-letter words I never heard in my life were spilled over me. He'd say, "Who the hell are you here anyway? Who had to get in here? What do you know? What am I going to say to Stalin?"
Stalin persuaded Roosevelt that his safety was best assured by residence at the Soviet embassy. The embassy had been specially prepared for his visit. It was bugged.
Stalin told me that the task he was putting to our group, and particularly to me, was ethically very unattractive. However, the position of the USSR was so serious that he had to know what our allies were thinking.
Stalin was very skillful in dealing with Roosevelt and Churchill. Even Churchill began to quite like him, you know, and talk about Uncle Joe, which was quite affectionate term. And they both had this idea that if you treated him the right way, the phrase was, if you treat Uncle Joe like a member of our club, perhaps one day he will behave like a member of our club.
Every day at 8 in the morning, I had to go to Stalin. I went with all the transcripts, in Russian and in English. For about an hour, Stalin examined, in great detail, all of Roosevelt's conversations.
I don't think FDR was capable of conceiving of a man of such profound iniquity, coupled with enormous strategic cleverness, as Stalin. He had never met such a creature. And Stalin was an excellent actor, quiet, affable, reasonable. He sent them all away thinking this really is a great leader.
The Allies agreed that post-war Eastern Europe would be a Soviet zone of influence. Stalin would annex Eastern Poland. As compensation, the Poles would get a slice of Eastern Germany. Poland was offered no choice. Together, the Big Three mapped out the future. D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944, the biggest seaborne invasion in history, lands in France. This was the second front Stalin longed for. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies continued to advance.
Nazi rode back out of Russia. Every rail line blown up as they flee. Of course, Nazi propaganda now stresses the masterful retreat. The Soviet flag unfurled in triumph over Sarny, Tarnopol, Odessa, as the Russian tide of victory rolls westward toward Germany.
As the Red Army approached Warsaw, the Polish resistance seized the city from the Germans. The Poles hoped to liberate themselves and confront Stalin with an independent Poland.
The Polish Home Army rose to take over Warsaw when the Germans left and before the Russians arrived. And the Russians had encouraged them to do this. And then the Russian army stopped on the Vistula.
Stalin claimed that his armies needed to pause outside Warsaw and regroup. The Germans counterattacked.
Polish freedom fighters were abandoned by the Russians, who were sitting with their forces across the river and could easily have gone in to help them. I thought for various reasons that that was the point at which American policy should have changed.
The Poles held out alone against the Germans for 63 days. When the Rising collapsed in slaughter and Warsaw was destroyed, Poland blamed the Soviet Union. Then, with Poland under Soviet occupation, Churchill and Stalin got down to power broking in Moscow. One night, Churchill scribbled down a formula for carving up Europe. Romania, Soviet influence 90%. Greece, 90% British and American. Yugoslavia and Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 75% Russian. Stalin ticked his agreement. Churchill wondered if the note should be destroyed. Stalin told him, no, you keep it. Yalta in the Crimea. Churchill wanted the next Big Three meeting to be held in the West, but Stalin insisted on a Soviet meeting place.
Stalin wanted to please them. And I will tell you, I only saw how hard people worked with everything devastated around, bringing crystal glass, bringing white napkins and tablecloths and furniture. Even when Mr. Winston Churchill said once, you know, sort of, oh, I wish I had a lemon with my gin and tonic. The next day they found a lemon tree.
The journey was torment for the sick Roosevelt. His polio and the strains of war leadership dragged him down. In the former Tsar's palace, the leaders faced a heavy agenda. They must decide how to govern a defeated Germany, and they wanted to get the Polish question settled.
Eastern Europe, important though it was only one of many other things. First of all, winning the war and then occupying Germany. Secondly, seeing to the war against Japan. Thirdly, the post-war arrangements.
Stalin knew that the war was won. After all, the Russians were only 40 miles from Berlin at that time. They were on the point of capturing Budapest. They'd swept through parts of Eastern Europe, not the whole lot yet.
He was a very shrewd negotiator. He doesn't look you in the eye. He's just sort of smoking. He was a chain smoker. And he was just sort of smoking, and you think that probably he's not listening, you know. Then all of a sudden, he would raise his fingers.
The terrible mistake that Roosevelt made was that he was trying to ingratiate himself into Stalin's favor by stressing the divisions between Churchill and himself. So he made it quite clear to Stalin that there were real divisions as well as imaginary ones.
For us, of course, the major topic was the future of Eastern Europe and above all Poland. And on that, Stalin obviously was bound to get what he wanted because the Red Army was in occupation of the whole area, including Poland. They'd already gone through Poland into Germany by the time we were in Yalta.
By now, the Balkans and most of Poland were in Soviet hands. So too was much of Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Battlefield facts that diplomacy could not alter.
We got at Yalta 2 diplomatic documents, which, on paper, were perfectly satisfactory. I mean, that there would be a coalition government in Poland, including people from the West, and there would be free elections in Poland. And then there was a declaration covering the whole of Eastern Europe, called the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which again was to be rebuilt on the basis of democracy and free elections and all the rest of it. Of course, phrases which the Russian used, but interpreted rather differently.
Stalin promised that the Polish elections would be free and fair. Tired of arguing, the others took him at his word. Germany would be governed jointly by the victorious Allies, and Stalin secretly pledged to join the war against Japan. Churchill was confident.
We have all bound ourselves to work together to make sure that there is increasing happiness and prosperity for the broad masses of the people in every land, no longer subject to the hard strains of war. There is the prospect which has now opened before us.
funeral special heads for Washington. An honor guard of servicemen keeps vigil beside the flag-draped casket. At villages, crossroads, way stations, the people who were so close to his heart stand silently, expressive of the devotion Franklin Roosevelt inspired.
As the president was buried, the last battles in Europe were ending. American troops were taking over German towns without resistance.
They were glad to see the American troops because they had a terrible fear of having Russians occupy or come into their area.
As the Allies advanced, they discovered the full horror of German crimes. The Jews had been the Nazis' special target, but every nation was mourning over mass graves. Fear of a German revival would overshadow the first years of peace. Soon, Soviet and American troops would meet in Germany.
Our lieutenant came in one day and said he wants to get the patrol together. We're going to go and see if we can find some Russians. Well, none of us were too eager to go on that patrol, really, because we realized the end of the war was imminent, and we didn't know what was out there. And, we had gotten this far. Why stick our necks out again?
We kept going, and we kept running into no resistance, and everybody was retiring and surrendering. And we just, I guess, were lucky we got to the Elbe River, and we saw the Russians on the other side.
I told my girlfriend, you stand there, and I'll stay here. We waited for them to come ashore. We could see their faces. They looked like ordinary people. We had imagined something different. Well, they were Americans.
I guess we didn't know what to expect from the Russians, but when you looked at them and examined them, you couldn't tell whether, if you put an American uniform on them, they could have been American.
We didn't know who we were kissing. We were just kissing everyone.
I think that for us, the war was over. We washed our feet in the Elbe River. We washed our faces and hands. We thought that now we'd met the Americans, the war must be over.
Two days later, the movie cameras were ready. The moment of history, the meeting of ordinary soldiers from Russia and America, was rerun dramatically with a bigger cast. By Allied agreement, the capture of Berlin was left to the Russians. April 1945, the Red Army launches its final offensive towards Berlin. The war cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives, nearly 40 times American and British losses put together. The red flag, destined to fly over the Reichstag, was a homemade affair.
We used tablecloths. One night I helped my friend, a Jewish tailor, sew them into 3 flags. We took them to Berlin. I found 3 soldiers and we climbed up. The first photograph I took was of the flag I'd brought from Moscow, the Soviet flag over Berlin.
As Hitler's Reich fell apart, hundreds gathered in San Francisco to found the United Nations organization. The Soviet delegation was led by the man who had signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, Molotov.
Molotov was very nervous because he felt that the war is coming to an end. Victory would soon be here, and here he is in America. That's why every day he sent cables to Stalin. When may I return?
As the San Francisco meeting continued, news came of Germany's surrender.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
As the fighting stopped, the Soviet front line had cut Europe in two, from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The war in the Pacific dragged on. American Marines had stormed Iwo Jima. It was a foretaste of how difficult and bloody the final invasion of Japan might be. Potsdam in conquered Germany, site of the third Allied summit.
The attitude in Washington toward the Soviet Union had begun to change well before Potsdam. Storm signals were already flying.
Truman declared officially, and quite sharply, that the declaration on Europe adopted at Yalta is not being carried out in some countries. Governments are being set up, which the United States will not recognize.
I'd call the Potsdam Conference a bad-tempered conference, because apart from the ceremonial occasions, it was really very bad-tempered.
The Allies couldn't easily agree about a German peace treaty or on how to carry out agreements reached at Yalta. Stalin confirmed that his troops were ready for war with Japan. But the day before the conference, America had successfully tested an atomic bomb.
President Truman, after consulting with the British and with his own military advisors, decided that he would tell Stalin that we had a powerful new weapon without identifying it as a nuclear weapon.
Truman repeated what he was saying about the new weapon. He thought Stalin didn't hear or didn't understand him. Stalin said, "Okay, thank you for the information."
There was some question amongst the Americans as to whether Stalin had really understood what Truman was saying. As we now know, they knew all about the Manhattan Project through espionage and their own agents.
With the conference still in session, news arrived from London that Clement Attlee had been elected British Prime Minister.
I had a feeling that the biggest sensation for Molotov and Stalin was not the bomb explosion, but the fact that Churchill was not re-elected in England.
Another photo call. The world must see that the Allies were still united. On August the 2nd, the conference ended and the statesmen went home. 4 days later, America dropped an atomic bomb on the city and people of Hiroshima. Three days after that, another was dropped on Nagasaki. Soon, the human race would be able to destroy itself in a day. At each Cold War crisis to come, the nuclear shadow threatened. Fulton, Missouri, a quiet little town in the Midwest. Not much has changed since 1946. Less than a year since the war had ended, the flags were up to welcome Winston Churchill. But he came to Fulton bringing a somber message for the world.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
The speech was not well received in the United States. It was thought to be too tough a speech. And the president was criticized by some for having Churchill over. This goes to show how history changes. Now it's one of the great speeches that's ever been made, because it helped warn the world about the danger of the Soviet aggrandizement.
Back from overseas came the Americans. For the second time in a century, the United States had been pulled into a world war far from its own shores. "300,000 Americans never came home. But the rest returned to a country wealthier and happier than ever before."
I sort of eased back into contentment. I said, gee, this is wonderful. People seem to have a little cushion of money now, which, back in the Depression years, no one had any money. You just had about enough money to put food on the table and put a roof over your head and keep your insurance policy in effect,
Before the war, we had 15%, maybe sometimes more, unemployed, and a very stagnant, unhappy economy. And the war production of munitions, production of armaments, put enormous sums of money into the economy, put millions of people to work, not only men but women, Rosie the Riveter, and we emerged from the war with virtual full employment.
As soon as the war was over, the factories, they realized, hey, the Americans have been without a car since before the war. Let's get back into automobile production. And of course, the people were anxious for automobile. There was gasoline available, foodstuffs became available. So the economy definitely was on the rise.
War and the post-war rush to spend put American capitalism back on its wheels. In the first summer of peace, the Soviet soldiers rode home. They were awed to find themselves still alive.
До Москвы уже совсем недалеко. Поезд идет из столицы Германии. И вот он, счастливый час. Здравствуй, родная Москва! Здравствуйте, герои-победители!
In the crowds that welcomed them, it was the lucky ones who found their sons or husbands. Some 27 million Soviet civilians and soldiers did not live to see this day.
И целовали людей незнакомых, радовались. Это было большое ликование.
We met the soldiers with flowers, bread, anything we could get hold of.
Люди, какая-то надежда появилась, что кто-то еще, кто может быть...
We kissed complete strangers. We were so happy.
Где он, потому что были же...
Our spirits were rising. We even dared hope that those who had gone missing might still be alive.
Очень надеялись, что, может быть, они найдут родных, что, может быть, это ошибка.
Главное, что были... The whole of Russia had been destroyed. Everything from the borders to Moscow lay in ruins.
Все было разорено.
There were lots of people with no homes to go to.
Возвращаться некуда.
Where the Germans had passed, nearly 70,000 villages had been destroyed. Cities lay in rubble. Stalin's pre-war achievements, the factories and apartment blocks of the five-year plans, had been wrecked by the invaders.
Things which before the war hadn't seemed too bad were completely destroyed. People were living in ruins. It's impossible to describe the suffering. You can only understand it if you've lived through it and seen it with your own eyes.
For Russians, the end of the fighting brought an instant of pure joy.
Ну что вам я могу сказать? В Берлине, в центре. Другой раз так забудешь, не вдумаешься глубоко, посмотришь. Напротив Рейхстаг, а здесь Бранденбургские ворота, которые Геббельс-то камнем, который заложил. Все равно прошли.
Berlin, the final battlefield. The capital of Hitler's Reich had fallen to the Red Army. Dazed Berliners waited to see what the conquerors would do to them. But there was no organized massacre. The survivors were allowed to live as best they could. Stalin even ordered his troops to feed the Berliners, but the soldiers looted homes, and all over the city they hunted down women.
More and more Russians came by. They looked through the window. Then one of them suddenly came in. I was babysitting. He took the child from my lap and gave it a toy and some cigarettes to play with. That was the first time I was raped. It was terrifying. Afterwards, I couldn't speak.
Stalin's police chief Beria and Foreign Minister Molotov tour Berlin. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, and each of the Allies took a sector of the German capital. The Allies had decided that Germany should compensate them for war damage.
Marshal Zhukov said, "We have fought long and hard. We've captured Berlin. We have the moral and legal right to take out as much as possible in reparations. We don't know what the future holds."
The German population was forced to help the Russians seize industrial resources. Not just machines, thousands of craftsmen and scientists were kidnapped and taken to the Soviet Union. Central Europe was reverting to the Dark Ages. This was a space without law, shelter, or mercy. A continent of nomads. Millions of people uprooted by the Nazis were struggling home. Now it was the turn of the Germans to be the victims. From the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the victors were shaping Europe in their own image. Poland, the invaders' route to Russia, obsessed Stalin. Eastern Poland had been annexed by the Soviet Union. As compensation, the Allies shifted the whole country westward, giving Poland the eastern territories of Germany. The Germans were expelled. Poles, whose own homelands had been seized by the Soviet Union, now took over German farms and houses.
In the
fall of 1945, a young Polish woman, 19 years old, and an older man from the militia entered our house.
Und ein älterer Mann von der Miliz unser Haus betreten. Sie fragten
The girl asked, "Who does this house belong to?" And my mother said, "To us."
Ja, mir.
And Hania, that was the Polish girl's name, said, "Now it's mine." From then on, it was Hania's house.
Von Hania. Morgens 6 Uhr.
6 in the morning, the militia came and banged the butts of their weapons against the door.
Und sagen raus.
Out. Even though I was only a child, I knew this was it.
Ganz genau. Jetzt ist es echt.
From all over Europe, some 12 million Germans were expelled from lands they had lived in for centuries. Today it's called ethnic cleansing. Then the Allies called it population transfer, and the British helped to move the Germans out. Victory in London. From 6 years of war, Britain emerged happy, but inwardly exhausted. For the moment, people cheered for king and empire as if nothing had changed or ever would. The King's new Prime Minister was Clement Attlee. The British voters had swung leftwards, and Churchill was out. In foreign policy, the new Labour government held tightly to the American alliance. Ernest Bevin, the new Foreign Secretary, was a trade union veteran who mistrusted communists. He had backed Churchill's intervention in the Greek Civil War. British interests were at stake here. The concern was that the conflict might threaten Britain's oil route from the Middle East through the Mediterranean. The strongest resistance movement, the Communists, reached for power. But they didn't know that Stalin had told Churchill that he had no interest in a communist Greece. The British army moved in. The Civil War was long and cruel. But Stalin kept his word and left the Greek communists to their fate. The Soviet Union now dominated the nations along its western border. At first, Stalin did not impose a Soviet system on his new empire. Instead, he built up pro-Soviet coalition governments, but the communists made sure that the police and security were in their hands. The Yalta Conference had given Russia control of Central Europe.
We knew perfectly well what the Russians interpreted as democracy and all that, but then we were allies fighting a war together. We couldn't very well say to Stalin, now we are going to write down our interpretation of Western democracy and you've got to sign up and say this is your interpretation. It wasn't possible.
We began to receive cables from American representatives in what we were all later to call the satellite countries on the behavior of Soviet troops with respect to the people of Poland, of Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, and so on. So trouble was in the air.
What would happen is that such and such a prominent member of the Peasant Party of Bulgaria would be kidnapped, simply would disappear, or other figures who were not acceptable for inclusion in the People's Democratic new regimes would be disappeared.
In Berlin, where the Allies jointly supervised city life, the communists were careful.
The idea was at the beginning to cooperate and gradually to build up the party, making the best organized party, the most militant party, the most active party, and gradually increase the influence on the other parties and gradually take over the whole situation, but not at once. We should already prepare for building up the police. The man for personnel, who changes personnel. The man for education. So we were flabbergasted. We only 3 or 4 comrades and everybody else are social democrats and bourgeois democrats and so on. So one of us asked and said, it must look democratic, but we must have everything in our hands.
Many Germans perfectly well understood that brown, the Nazi colors, were becoming red overnight. After all, the methods, in some ways, were the same, or at any rate very similar, of forcing people to do things against their will.
For me, my only comparison was always the Soviet Union under Stalin. And comparable to the Soviet Union under Stalin, 1935 to 45, 45 to 46, 47 in Germany was wonderful. It was much less terror than which I had witnessed the 10 years before in the Soviet Union.
Soviet communism had stood the test of war. The Red Army was the biggest on earth, and General Eisenhower came to pay his respects to the world's newest superpower. But Stalin feared encirclement by the capitalist powers. At home, he watched for treachery. Those who had been taken prisoner by the Germans and seen a glimpse of the West might become disloyal. They were being arrested in thousands. The Americans knew what was going on.
We had a maid whose husband was a prisoner of war. When he finally was repatriated and came back, it was this great reunion. Life was wonderful again. The family was reunited. 6 months later, He was arrested because he had been a German prisoner of war.
Some were there because of a general decree by Stalin. Some were deserters and thieves. Some white Russian emigres. Some Poles from the Home Army. I entered a whole new world. Prison camps were my university.
Poland. In the wreckage of Warsaw, the Poles began to clear the ruins. The Poles had fought the Germans on every front, east and west. Now they worked together to rebuild their country. Some loathed the new semi-communist government tied to Moscow, but others found reasons to accept it and live with it.
The most important thing for me was for my mother and sister to come from Siberia, and for us to begin rebuilding the country. We also needed to secure our borders, which were seriously threatened. Staying in the army gave me that chance.
In Moscow, Poland's new puppet leaders were taken to the opera. The Poles agreed to a close alliance with the Soviet Union. Stalin promised to defend the new Polish frontiers against any German attempt to win back the lost territories. Stalin was at the zenith of his power. His colleagues felt terror in his presence.
Russian diplomats, like all other Russian officials or party members or whatever, lived in terror of the great man, and justifiably so, because if they gave unpopular advice, they might find themselves in a concentration camp or with a bullet in the back of their heads. It wasn't very easy to give good advice to Stalin if it was unpalatable.
Он сидел такой веселый, настроение у него хорошее, рядом сидел с ним.
Stalin was cheerful and in high spirits. At his side were the main guest, the interpreter, and Soviet guests too.
Другие гости, наши, все так. И когда раздавали официанты там какой-то...
The waiters came in with the main course. I think it was turkey. One of them, whilst he was pouring the sauce, dropped some red liquid on Stalin's sand-colored jacket.
Этот китель, да, красный такой, жидкость эту самую, сок красный, да, и этот он как струйка крови, знаете, так потекла по всему этому красивому, нарядному, торжественному мундиру.
They were in a state of shock about what would happen, because the stains looked like drops of blood.
Замерли в испуге, что будет вообще.
But Stalin didn't react. He continued to talk with his neighbor.
Вот, к нему там подскочил какой-то обслуживающий шеф, там
Then another waiter came up to him with some water and offered to sponge it out. But Stalin said, no, no, and he was absolutely calm. People saw that things seemed to be okay. Everyone began eating again, and the routine continued.
Спокойно до конца и просидел.
To mark the Soviet elections, Stalin made a grand appearance. To his exhausted people, he promised no rewards, but only more effort, more 5-year plans for heavy industry. Then, in cloudy words, he warned that capitalism and imperialism made future wars inevitable. Did this mean war between the Soviet Union and the West? Abroad, alarm bells rang.
I read the speech with care and interpreted it as being a delayed declaration of war against the United States. Wasn't any doubt about it if you read the text carefully, what he was talking about.
The speech was interpreted in the West as no less than a prediction of World War III. I don't think this was right, though.
Но я думаю, что это вряд ли правильно. Во всяком случае,
Stalin didn't say anything new or different in that speech.
Сталин не сказал.
He said what he had always believed, that with imperialism and capitalism, war was inevitable.
С империализмом, с капитализмом неизбежно.
What the Russians were thinking in terms of was that, and I think Stalin thought in these terms, was that communism was one day going to rule, be the dominant ideology in the world, and all countries gradually were going to become communist. And in the meantime, you didn't, in Stalin's idea, start dangerous wars which you might lose, but if you had a good chance of pushing the cause along, you always pushed it along.
Stalin had relaxed his dictatorship during the war, but now he was tightening it once more. The Soviet Union's obvious suspicion of the West disturbed Washington. An American diplomat in Moscow, George Kennan, was asked what he thought was going on.
When they finally sent me a telegram expressing their astonishment and concern because the Russians were dragging their feet about joining the International Bank, I thought, well, for goodness sake, I can't answer that in one question. They're going to have to give me space. And I sat down and tried to give a picture of this government as it emerged from the war.
One of the strengths of Kennan was his awareness that the Russia in which we were living, Stalin's Soviet Russia, communism, people called it, actually drew in very many ways upon the Russian past.
I had to go right back to page 1 and to try to tell them things that I felt they'd forgotten during the war. This all hangs together with this whole question that this was the same group of people who had dealt with Hitler, had tried to deal with Hitler at our expense, and never had changed their views about us.
Kennan's Moscow embassy cable became history, an 8,000-word prophecy that the Soviet Union was in the mood to expand across the world and must be contained.
The day that telegram was drafted, I unfortunately or fortunately had the night duty at the code room. And was rather perturbed about it because I happened to have a very heavy date that night. There was a dance at one of the other embassies, and I wanted to get out as early as possible. About 6:30 or 7, George comes walking in with a 6-part cable, which he wants to send out. And I took a look at it and said it was nice, but let's not send it out. Let's wait till tomorrow. And I tried to talk him into not sending it. He said, Washington wants it, they're going to get it, and you stay here and do it.
Kennan's telegram alarmed Washington. Days later, its message was reinforced when Churchill arrived in the United States as President Truman's guest.
They began to get to know each other. Our president, said to Mr. Churchill, I will be on this trip quite a while, and I would be glad if you would call me Harry. Well, Mr. Churchill said, I'll be glad to if you will call me Winston. Mr. Truman said, I don't believe I can do that. He said, I consider you the first citizen in the world, and I just don't believe I can call you Winston. Winston Churchill said, if you can't call me Winston, then I can't call you Harry. The president said, on that basis, we'll do it. So it went Winston and Harry from that time, and they got on very well.
Churchill was due to speak to a college audience at Fulton in Truman's home state. Privately, he showed Truman what he was going to say. The president, not sure that the American public was ready for an attack on its wartime Soviet ally, let Churchill test the water.
Mr. Churchill, he's one of the great men of the age. He's a great Englishman. He's a great Englishman, but he's half American.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Except in the British Commonwealth and in the United States, where communism is in its infancy, the communist parties or fifth columns constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization. Whatever conclusions may be drawn from these facts, in fact they are, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace.
Immediately after that, Stalin came out with answers to a foreign correspondent's questions in which he compared Churchill to Hitler and decried Churchill's speech as a call, a belligerent call to arms against Soviet Russia.
Since 1945, America had been extending its influence and power all over the world. Stalin grew nervous. He put pressure on Turkey to grant the Soviet Union a military presence in the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. America and Britain feared a threat to the Suez Canal. They were determined to keep Turkey free of Soviet interference. When the Turkish ambassador in Washington died suddenly, Truman used America's biggest battleship, the USS Missouri, to deliver the body to Istanbul.
This was a symbol to Stalin. Don't push us, and don't push Turkey, because if you push Turkey, we'll be there.
Iran, like Turkey, lay on the southern borders of the Soviet Union, and for centuries had been hostile to Russia. During the war, Soviet and British troops had occupied Iran to protect their oil supplies. They even celebrated their partnership there. The old Shah, thought to be pro-German, was dethroned and replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. There was an agreement that once the war was over, the British and Soviet troops would both pull out.
When the occupation was due to end, Stalin didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay on. This created problems. There was lots of pressure put on us, pressure from the British. And in fact, the Soviet Union had no legal right to stay there.
Iran presented the Security Council of the newly founded United Nations with its first crisis.
That's Mr. Gromyko proposing to the Security Council that the hearing of the Persian case should be postponed.
The Soviet Union tried to prevent further discussion. They lost.
Mr. Gromyko and the other Russians then walked out. Their dramatic exit seems to have caused no obvious reaction at the time, though we can imagine what most of those present were thinking. One good thing, however, emerges from this incident. The Security Council had stood its ground.
6 weeks later, Stalin ceremonially withdrew his forces from Iran. But Truman, shaken by his behavior, suspected that Stalin was aiming at world domination.
He said, I want to be in position to document our concern. Go back over the recent agreements and list one by one the violations in which the Soviets have engaged.
I was then Mr. Clifford's assistant, and he turned the task over to me. We talked about it a bit, and I said, well, it seems to me that that's only scratching the surface, a list of agreements broken. There are much more fundamental problems in our relations with the USSR than that. So let's go at it in a somewhat broader way.
We spent weeks on it then, interviewed most of the top officials in the United States.
There was absolute unanimity in all of the agencies concerned as to the nature of problems we had and the kind of response we were going to have to make.
We ended up the report by saying, the policy of our country should be set and clearly set. The Soviet Union constitutes a real menace to freedom in this world. Freedom in Europe, freedom in the United States. So we must prepare for it.
The Clifford-Elsie report was kept secret. The report concluded that a war with the USSR would be more total, more horrible than anything previously known. The United States still had the monopoly of atomic weapons. At Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, 2 atom bombs were detonated in July 1946. The warning to Stalin was plain. From now on, all the big powers worked frantically to develop their own atomic and biological weapons. At the Paris Conference of Foreign Ministers, Molotov was determined to maintain joint Allied control of Germany. But his American counterpart, Secretary of State Burns, wanted Germany to pay no more reparations. For Molotov, Burns was too concerned with German opinion. He was outraged.
Молотов, господин, нет.
Molotov was nicknamed Mr. No, but if he had been a Mr. Yes, Stalin would not have kept him on. Stalin needed a Mr. No, someone capable of finding out the maximum information about the other side's position. Molotov would squeeze the other side to its absolute limit. When he had totally exhausted these methods, it was Stalin's turn. He would come back and resolve matters with a friendly smile.
It was at Paris that the wartime alliance began finally to break up. The Americans and the British were impatient to develop stable economies in their zones of Germany without Soviet interference.
Stuttgart, Germany, scene of an event that marks a new phase in Europe's destiny. Secretary of State James F. Burns is here to set forth the policy of the United States on Germany, a speech widely interpreted as marking the end of America's appeasement of Russia. Burns tells the Germans and the world,
"It is not in the interest of the German people or in the interest of world peace that Germany should become a pawn or a partner in a military struggle for power between the East and the West."
I listened to the Burns Stuttgart speech with marked approval because, in fact, I had written most of it. And those of us who worked on it, and Burns, were not thinking in anti-Soviet terms.
The American people want to return the government of Germany to the people of Germany. The American people want to help the German people to win their way back to an honorable place among the free and peace-loving nations of the world.
In 1945, the Allies had approved Poland's annexation of Germany's eastern provinces up to the Oder and Neisse rivers. But now Burns suggested that the new frontier was unfair to Germany and might be changed.
It
was a shocking statement. It made us think that our western border was being questioned by the Germans and by other Western countries.
Jest I będzie kwestionowana przez mocarstwa zachodnie, przez Niemcy.
It was one of the most important things that strengthened our ties with the Soviet Union.
Umacniał nasze sojusznicze stosunki ze Związkiem Radzieckim.
More pictures have arrived from Moscow. They show the everyday scene in the Soviet capital's famous Red Square. And what's in their shops? Well, here's a glimpse of the sort of things now on display. These new fashions, our cameraman tells us, are so expensive that they're quite beyond the means of ordinary people in Russia today.
Ordinary people were much worse off than the newsreels showed.
It was a very hard time. I had a son who was 1.5 years old. He used to get a plate from the cupboard and walk after me saying, "Give me, give me." But I had nothing to give him. We used to go to the market and buy horse feed.
On the collective farms, war damage and the death of so many workers at the front were deepening a grave food shortage.
I took a trip down through the Ukraine, and it was the time of the 47 famine that was going on down there, about which nothing was heard in the outside world. Soviets were talking about great grain harvests and everything else. We got down there, on the train stops, you would see children with distended bellies begging for bread. At the out in Odessa itself, people lying out on the streets outside the hospitals where they couldn't take them in, starving to death. There was malnutrition everywhere.
In Germany, too, hunger and disease were spreading. The nightmare of the Western Allies was that poverty would drive the Germans towards communism.
There was never enough food. We were always hungry. In those days, we went on scavenging trips. We went to farmers and begged. Sometimes we got something, other times nothing.
America's General Lucius Clay reflected, "There is no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000. Aid to Germany cost Britain over $1 million a day. But British supplies were not enough to save thousands of Germans who died that winter for lack of food and fuel. Britain, too, was weakening. The fierce winter of 1946-47 brought industry to a standstill. The country's economy, undermined by 6 years of war, began to seize up. Coal ran out, electricity failed, and food rationing grew even tighter.
You know, people forget again, we never had bread rationing during the war. We had bread rationing after it. And that was because we were pouring wheat into Germany to prevent mass starvation there.
That was a bad winter altogether. It was cold and crops were bad. People were unhappy. And the communists were making strenuous gains here, there, and the other place, particularly in Italy and in France, but also in Germany.
The British could no longer afford all their heavy commitments in the Mediterranean. They told the Americans they intended to pull out.
The message came, and it was flat. It said, Great Britain is withdrawing from both economic aid and military aid to Greece and Turkey.
This simply crystallized the opinions in the executive branch that the United States had to move, and move very, very quickly.
The prospect didn't look good at all for Europe or for the United States or for anybody.
In Washington, President Truman went to Congress. From now on, he announced, the United States would contain the advance of communism anywhere on the globe. This, at last, was the official declaration of the Cold War. Italy, 1947. 2 years since the war's end. Poverty plagues much of the country. Fertile ground for communism, which promises a solution to economic ills and injustice.
Life was extremely hard. Besides the political tensions, there was always a sense of having to tighten your belt. We were hungry. We were always hungry.
As membership of the Communist Party reaches 2 million, America fears that Italy and Western Europe could fall to communism.
The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and war. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive.
May Day in Moscow, 1947. The Red Army was the largest fighting force in the world. Stalin had established control over most of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union offered an alternative model for society: public ownership and a centrally planned economy, in contrast to the Western belief in a mixed economy and free trade.
There was great alarm at the deteriorating political and economic situation, and fear that the domestic communists in Western Europe would become so active and so disruptive that it would lead to economic collapse, which was probably going to happen anyway unless something was done. And this would give an opportunity to the Soviets to extend their influence in Western Europe.
In February 1947, a financial crisis forced the British government to tell Washington they were ending aid to Greece and Turkey. The administration feared the Eastern Mediterranean might fall to communism. Truman used this opportunity to take the offensive.
The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
I was there in the balcony listening, and I was struck by the absolute concentrated attention of the Congress. On this occasion, everyone in the hall realized that this was a major historical event.
I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million for the period ending June 30th, 1948.
Truman pitched the struggle for the first time as between freedom and tyranny, the West and the communists. Truman had to persuade the often isolationist Congress to act. The anti-communism of the Truman Doctrine did just that.
The Truman speech reflected very clearly Truman's own character. He liked to see issues very clearly and to come up with clean-cut answers.
After 5.5 years of a war to defeat fascism, Europe was bankrupt. Industry lay in ruins. Homes were in rubble. People struggled to survive. The Communist Party, which had fought fascism, attracted new recruits.
The appeal of communism to young people and to students was that of a hope that it was possible to create a classless society. Many people believed that communism was going to create a better world, better than the one that existed before the war. This was the only party that you could join if you wanted to change the world.
The man called on by Truman to face the communist threat was the newly appointed Secretary of State, General Marshall, the wartime military leader. He would plan the United States response.
Marshall was an extraordinary man. I've never known anyone like him. He, in many respects, was a very austere, unapproachable man. He never allowed anyone to call him George Marshall, including the president. When the president asked him if he should, he said no, General Marshall will do. He exuded leadership and character.
In March, Marshall met Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov at a meeting in Moscow. Britain and France were there too. The Big Four tried to agree on the future of Germany. Despite warm Russian hospitality, weeks of meetings got nowhere.
Marshall made one last effort. He had an interview with Stalin in the Kremlin, and that interview convinced Marshall that what the Soviets were doing were stalling for time in order for the situation in Western and Central Europe to become more and more adverse, so that popular unrest would become greater and greater, the communists would grow in strength, and that maybe communist regimes would come to power in Western Europe without the Red Army having to invade.
At the heart of Europe's problems lay the question of a defeated Germany. Stalin wanted to keep Germany on its knees, concerned that otherwise it would rise up one day and threaten the Soviet Union again. The Americans believed that Germany must get back on its feet before there could be a full European recovery. Marshall was now convinced of the need to act quickly. On his return from Moscow, he instructed the State Department to begin preparing ideas for a European rescue plan. Billions of dollars would be needed. Would Congress approve this enormous cost?
The whole situation is critical in the extreme. We happen to be, very fortunately for ourselves, the strongest nation in the world today, certainly economically.
The urgency was such that Marshall rushed forward his plan. He announced it at an awards ceremony at Harvard University. There were no film cameras present. Marshall proposed aid to Europe on a vast scale and invited the Europeans to respond. Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, immediately realized the importance of Marshall's speech. He had always wanted to involve the Americans in European reconstruction.
When Marshall made his big speech in Harvard, Bevin seized upon it, and bringing the French in at the same time, welcomed it, and out of that they built up what became the European Recovery Program and the recovery of Western Europe.
The Soviet economy also desperately needed investment to make up for the ravages of 4 years of war on Russian soil. In theory, the Marshall Plan was open to both East and West, but would Stalin participate?
Stalin was always suspicious, and he wasn't keen on it from the very start. He said, just you watch it. The situation is quite different from the wartime Lend-Lease American assistance to us. With the Truman Doctrine in place as well, they don't really want to help us. They just want to tear the people's democracies away from our sphere of influence, to win them over, to infiltrate them, to pull them away from the Soviet Union.
In Paris, a foreign ministers' conference opened to frame the European response to the Marshall Plan. Despite Stalin's caution, Molotov and a large Soviet delegation turned up at the conference table.
Molotov listened to all the reports and proposals, although he felt it was clearly not that straightforward, that the aid would be tied up with certain conditions.
Throughout the Cold War, spies were used by both sides. At this critical point, spies in London were passing their Soviet controllers document after document.
Dozens. I mean, all the diplomatic going in and out from the Foreign Office, we had access to everything.
After 6 days of meetings in Paris, Soviet intelligence gave Stalin new information about the Marshall Plan.
Our intelligence service knew everything. We've read all the documents which were produced by the United States, by the government of the United States, which was sent to almost all European countries, including the government of the Soviet Union, but and other documents which were not sent to the Soviet Union.
This information confirmed that America didn't really want us to participate in it. They just made this demonstrative gesture in order not to scare away those already dealing with them. Stalin abruptly told Molotov to pull out of the negotiations.
As Molotov left the Paris meeting, he accused the West of dividing Europe into two hostile camps.
There never was any thought that the Soviets would actually join the Marshall Plan. But it was a desirable step to persuade the world that we really were being altruistic here. This was not basically an anti-communist, anti-Soviet measure. And should, by some miracle, the Soviets themselves join, or some of their satellite countries, we would have welcomed them in it. But we didn't think that was a realistic possibility.
In Prague, the Czechoslovaks discussed whether to join the Marshall Plan. In the democratically elected government, a third of the ministers were communists.
The reactions were absolutely positive. Even the communist ministers in the government, in the Czechoslovak government, agreed with our participation in Paris. That means to attend the conference to prepare the Marshall Plan. The decision of the Czechoslovak government was absolutely unanimous.
Stalin summoned the Czech Prime Minister, Klement Gottwald, to Moscow. With him came the Foreign Minister, Jan Masaryk. They arrived on the afternoon of July 9th and waited.
At once about 11 o'clock in the evening, that means before midnight, somebody came that they should immediately go over to Kremlin. But the principal question put before them was that the Czechoslovak delegation shouldn't go over to Paris to attend to the conference on the Marshall Plan.
Stalin said, if by 4 a.m. on the 11th of July you have not refused to attend, then be prepared. This will have serious consequences on our relations with you.
Stalin was quite clear, quite rough, and he gave the ultimatum of 4 hours to our delegation to say their decision. Finally, the same government which accepted unanimously the presence in Paris rejected it. As far as the Marshall Plan is concerned, there was no normal discussion. There was practically only a quite clear order. You have to do it, and if you do not do it, so you are not our friends. You are betraying the Union, Soviet Union, and so on and so on. So this was quite clear.
When the Czech delegation left Moscow, Gottwald read a prepared statement. He couldn't hide his discomfort.
Народы станут еще крепче. Поэтому да здравствует вечная дружба и союз Советского Союза и Чехословакии, да здравствует героический советский народ и его великий вождь генералиссимус Сталин.
Jan Masaryk was shattered by the experience.
When he came out from the plane, he said quite clearly, I was going to Moscow as a minister of a free state, and I am returning as Stalin's slave.
In September 1947, 16 European nations signed up for the Marshall Plan and requested $20 billion of aid. The Western Alliance began to take shape. The battle lines of the Cold War were being drawn.
The primary purpose was compassionate, goodwill, the notion that our former allies needed to have the help of the United States.
The policy of the Marshall Plan was seen in the Soviet Union as the Americans wanting to impose their influence over the countries to which they gave Marshall aid. The Soviet Union could not accept that, believing it to be an aggressive act on behalf of the Americans. That is why the Marshall Plan was never accepted in our country.
That September 1947, Stalin revived the pre-war Communist International as the Cominform. Through it, Stalin planned to control the countries of the Eastern Bloc. He also instructed communist parties in the West to take the initiative in seizing power. In American propaganda, the Cominform was represented as a sinister, shadowy conspiracy of evil. But its economic associate, Comecon, offered Russian aid to Eastern Bloc countries, sending grain to Czechoslovakia after a bad harvest.
Both Cominform and Comecon were a direct response to the Marshall Plan. On the one hand, the Cominform would follow the political, ideological line the Soviet Union wanted to adopt in the socialist countries. On the other hand, the aim of Comecon was to provide economic assistance in order to prevent these countries from being torn from our sphere of influence.
February 1948, the Communists reach for power in Czechoslovakia. Workers' militias go on the march. Non-communists are arrested. Action committees take over the police and the labor unions. President Beneš capitulates. The red flag flies in the center of Prague. In just 5 days, the communists took over Czechoslovakia's government. Stalin's rule was imposed on the Czechs. 2 weeks later, Jan Masaryk fell to his death from the window of his apartment in Prague. The argument still rages. Did he despair and jump, or was he pushed? Masaryk was the son of Thomas Masaryk, the founder of the Czech state. His funeral symbolized the end of a free Czechoslovakia.
After the death of the minister, and there were really tens of thousands of people who were coming to say farewell to the minister, the last farewell. They were crying and flowers and so on and so on. But the general persuasion was that there was really the end. We felt it like that, unfortunately.
The communist takeover in Prague shocked Washington. There, the case for Marshall aid was still being argued before a partly isolationist Congress.
The Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe. It is this ruthless course of action and the clear design to extend it to the remaining free nations of Europe that have brought about the critical situation in Europe today.
It was touch and go when both houses of Congress were finally considering the legislation. Then the Czech coup occurred, and that was the final straw, because even the isolationists, or most of them, could see that the Russians were advancing westward with the takeover in Czechoslovakia and so on. So it helped very importantly to pass the legislation.
On April 3rd, 1948, Congress approved $5 billion of Marshall aid. The Marshall Plan was born from the need to feed the hungry and to prevent communism spreading over Europe. $20% of the aid were loans, 80% grants. The first shipments were foods and fertilizers. Next, machines to improve agricultural efficiency. In the 4 years of the plan, the Marshall Agency spent $13.5 billion in 16 countries.
Fewer people spent more money in that agency than ever before or since in the United States government. It was an extraordinary performance.
Europe's purchase of American goods and machinery redirected many Marshall Aid dollars back into American industry, fueling a post-war boom.
Most people I knew felt that the generosity of Americans was a self-serving one, in the sense that they thought of Europe as an outlet for their goods, as a market to export stuff, and we thought that we could see that in the types of things that they wanted us to buy with the money that they lent us.
One of the countries most in need of help was Greece, devastated by the Nazi occupation and years of civil war. In the north, government troops still hunted out communist guerrillas.
Greece, of course, emerged from the war in a terrible state. Probably 2,000 of the nation's villages had been razed and burnt to the ground by the reprisal raids of the Nazis. The consequence of the Civil War was to add to that terribly shredded kind of social fabric.
During the 4 years of the Marshall Plan, Greece received nearly $700 million of economic assistance. Young Americans were thrust into positions of heavy responsibility.
I was the youngest member of the Marshall Plan mission in Greece. I arrived there at the age of 23, and to my astonishment, a year later, at age 24, there I was in charge of the Greek import program. The range of projects which we engaged in were all over the map and all over every single sector of the economy. And one could say that America fed and fueled and clothed the Greek nation.
In the hill villages of northern Greece emerging from civil war, the Marshall planners came up with a scheme to meet a local need.
During the war and during the Civil War, one of the major elements destroyed was the farm draft animal. One of the decisions was to import that which we were accustomed to, which was the Missouri mule. And the Missouri mule is not only cantankerous, he's big.
American mules arrived in Greece after a long sea voyage.
The village leaders informed us about the mules. We went down to the cooperative in Xanthi, and that's where they gave us the mules.
The farmers drew lots.
You took a piece of paper with the number of the mule written on it. Then you went to the overseer. He looked at your paper and gave the mule with that number to you. And then he said, take it.
The only problem was that the American mules were very much larger than the animals local farmers were used to.
The mules were very good. They were a bit wild, but slowly we got them under control. They were fat and big, and we began to use the mules to plough.
They were very good. They gave me a superb mule, and we started to plough.
The American mules were best. They were from the stable, well-fed and fat. You could put 200 kilos on them, and they could take it. Our own mules were small. We were very thankful. How could we not be thankful, since we had nothing? Long live America.
Industrial Europe faced other problems. France, 1947. Workers at the Renault factory near Paris went on strike. When communist ministers backed them, they were expelled from the government. Several months of disruption followed. Strikes spread. In the fall, 3 million workers took to the streets.
We had a lot of sympathy for the strikers because we felt that they were poorly paid, and we felt that the government wouldn't do anything for them unless they put pressure on the government.
Ministers feared civil war. The United States made it clear to Paris that there would be no Marshall aid to French industry until the government had the communist threat under control. Acts of sabotage culminated in the derailing of an express train, causing 20 deaths. The strikers lost popular support. The disruption ended. The French Fourth Republic would now receive Marshall aid, $2.7 billion of it. Yugoslavia had gone communist at the end of the war, without help from Moscow. The Yugoslav leader, Tito, became an ally of Stalin. But it was an uneasy alliance.
Tito, in Stalin's view, was acquiring more and more an independent position in various ways, including international affairs. Tito didn't consult or seek advice from Stalin in advance. He was moving further and further away from the socialist direction. The split came in 1948 when Stalin expelled Tito from the Cominform. Following the rift, Tito turned to the West. After a series of disastrous harvests, Tito requested American economic assistance. In 1950, he signed an agreement with the United States government. Yugoslavia emerged from behind the Iron Curtain. American agents distributed more than $150 million worth of aid.
This was not totally an altruistic effort. The United States had enormous self-interest in the success of the Marshall Plan. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been undertaken. America had a vital stake in the recovery of Western Europe. If the United States had allowed Europe to collapse, it would have cost us much more than what we spent on the Marshall Plan. We were doing well by doing good.
But as well as doing good, Washington was preparing other tactics. In Italy, by 1948, the Communist Party, led by Togliatti, dominated the left-wing Popular Front. The Christian Democrats, led by De Gasperi, ran the government. In April, the first general election since the war raised expectations of a communist victory through the ballot box.
Io mi aspettavo che il Fronte Popolare, I expected the Popular Front, the union of all the parties of the left, to win the election. This union of the left had to get together to counterbalance the Christian Democrats and the forces of the right.
Some Italians feared a communist victory.
That election could have been a touch-and-go election between Italy saying on one side of the world, on the other side of the world. First of all, I think it would have been a tragedy for Italy, but I think it would have been a tragedy for Europe, I think it would have been a tragedy for the Mediterranean, and it would have been a setback for America.
In the United States, a campaign was orchestrated to persuade Italian Americans to write to relatives urging them not to vote communist. 10 million letters were sent.
Dear cousin Maria, have you thought what a communist victory would mean for Italy? It would be terrible.
Italy would be ruled direct from the Kremlin. Look what happened in Czechoslovakia.
You must realize how serious the situation is. You should see what the papers are saying.
Please,
here.
Listen to us. I urge you not to vote communist in the elections. Your cousin, Luigi.
Fu un'iniziativa molto intelligente perché arrivava direttamente alle famiglie.
It was a very intelligent initiative because it got through to the families directly.
Mezzo secolo di emigrazione.
After half a century of emigration, there were hundreds of thousands of Italian families in America. So, to receive a letter of encouragement from them, a letter stating that they shouldn't vote for the Communist Party, well, that was very influential.
Letter writing was not enough. The newly created CIA decided to take the offensive.
What the CIA needed was authority
to develop a program of covert action. General Marshall knew that the situation in Italy was critical. The largest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Empire. Not having an organization and knowing that the State Department could not achieve the things that he knew had to be done, he personally said, we must explore the means of getting authority to carry out a covert action program that would challenge this tremendous communist threat.
This led to a debate within the young CIA. Did it have the legal authority to carry out covert operations? CIA lawyers studied the wording of the new National Security Act.
If the president of the National Security Council, the head of the National Security Council, is the president of the United States, and if he specifically directs the CIA under Hillenkotter to carry out operations to help Democratic parties, and if the Congress that was put in, if the Congress gives the money to support such a thing, then the authority is there. And that was the green light.
The CIA then intervened. It began covert operations in support of anti-communists and of the Christian Democrat Party.
I was in that branch of the CIA at the time that had to rush into the breach without training in covert action. And we had bags of money that we delivered to selected politicians to defray their political expenses, their campaign expenses, for posters, for pamphlets.
Io direttamente non sono a conoscenza di questo.
Personally, I'm not aware of that. It was spoken of, but I don't know anything about it, because I was never directly involved in party affairs.
The Church, too, mounted a powerful campaign against the communists.
Pope Pius XII was very concerned about the Communist Party. Not so much about their politics, he was concerned about their doctrine. And as Pope, Pius XII had to be concerned about what was happening in Italy at the time.
A network of election committees was created. They worked in close parallel to the organization of the Catholic Church.
I can say that all the parties envied our electoral structure, and especially the creation of election posters. In the rural areas, there were no cinemas. It was unthinkable at that time. So we had this idea. We sent some lorries out into towns and villages, and we projected the films at night, electioneering films. When we showed those films, everybody used to rush to the squares where the films were projected. They were always very crowded.
They unleashed this tremendous campaign against the left, against the communists, against the socialists, and they told the most terrible lies about them. Things out of this world. The church had a great influence over the people because 90% of them were Catholics and members of the church.
At that particular time, I was a practicing Catholic. I was extremely rigorous about attending Mass. I never missed it. One Sunday I went to Mass, and the priest was preaching from the pulpit. And he said one sentence which struck me very deeply at the time. I still remember it. He said that the war against the communists was a holy war.
Pope Pius XII and the Catholic Church had supported the fascists throughout their decades of rule. But the Vatican totally opposed communism. Just days before the election, Pius XII excommunicated many members of the Italian Communist Party.
When I heard about it, I was terribly upset. To begin with, there was the fact that at the time I was engaged to my fiancé. We were getting married the next year, and this meant we couldn't get married in church.
Pope Pope Pius XII excommunicated us,
ufficialmente come pontefice,
communists and the friends of communists.
gli amici dei comunisti.
Not being able to marry in church meant I couldn't wear a white dress and have all the flowers, have the music playing. My uncle, who had been like a father to me when I was a child, couldn't even take me to the altar. Not to mention that as a Catholic, I very much believed that my marriage had to be blessed by the priest, who represented Christ on earth. And this was what I believed in.
Ma lei sa che in un discorso più dodicesimo...
You know that Pius XII, in one of his speeches, said you were either for Christ or against Christ.
Partito Comunista era contro Cristo.
And the Communist Party was against Christ. They were clearly atheists. So, it was a duty of the Pope and of the Church to protect their people. So there was no other protection on the part of the Church but to organize all the Christian movements to oppose the Communist Party.
On April 18th, 1948, Italy went to the polls. The Christian Democrats won a landslide victory. Italy would remain a member of the Western Alliance. The communist share of the vote was almost halved.
Ho pianto moltissimo.
I cried so much. We'd worked so hard to win this battle. It had been such an effort. I remember crying and crying and crying.
La vittoria fu superiore a quello che...
The victory was even greater than we had expected. It was the only time when we, on our own as Christian Democrats, had an absolute majority in Parliament.
The CIA, too, drew its conclusions from the election victory.
Well, it was very gratifying. We didn't know at that time that we had carried out the first political action, covert political action program in the history of American intelligence that would be followed by many, many, many more.
Now that Italy had elected to stay in the Western Bloc, the United States released a flood of martial aid. In Turin, the Fiat Motor Company received giant new assembly line machines from Detroit and Pittsburgh. Fiat was re-equipped with some of the most sophisticated machinery in Europe. Fiat's recovery would fuel the revival of Italian industry.
In Europe and in Italy especially, we thought of America as all-powerful. They had 50% of the world GNP, they had all the modern technology, they'd beaten the Nazi system. And I don't say that you didn't expect it, but we were pleasantly surprised to see the generosity of their foreign policy. And the generosity of their foreign policy at that moment was expressed through the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan also demonstrated the United States' desire to secure Europe's future. The message was, modernize your economies, and you too can be like us.
The Americans were trying to impose American ideas, American organization into Europe. There was a feeling that if the European economies were to be rebuilt, if Europe was to be competitive in the world economy again, it would have to imitate American production methods, American management methods, and so on. And many European businessmen were eager to do this.
In those years, I mean, the immediate post-war years, the whole of Europe was in a recession. So first of all, it helped us step out of a recession. It gave us a certain amount of speed to the economy. But that was the first step. The second real step that was it approached this European community on the whole. It brought us towards NATO, and it brought the European countries closer to each other and to the United States.
The Marshall Plan set out to build a European consumer society. The United States wanted a free enterprise Western Bloc, peaceful, united, and tied to American trade and capital. The Soviet Union was forced to build its own rival bloc. The people of the socialist countries would eye the West for 40 years and wonder.